Welcome, everyone, especially those of you who are learning English with the English with Narayana channel.
Yes, welcome. We're so glad you're here.
We're really excited to have you join us for this deep dive.
Yeah.
Today, we're going to be looking into a story.
It's quite a story.
It is. It is. The story of Rosemary Kennedy and something very important that happened to her. We have some information that tells a surprising and perhaps even a little sad story.
It's definitely a story that sparked a lot of curiosity over the years.
Yeah, and we want to help you understand exactly what happened to her and what it all meant, all while using simple English so it's easy for everyone to follow along.
Absolutely, breaking it down for you.
So, to get us started, Rosemary Kennedy. She was the oldest sister of John F. Kennedy.
Who, as many of you know, later became the President of the United States.
Exactly. And in 1960, while John F. Kennedy was actually running for president, a newspaper mentioned something about Rosemary. It said that she had been living in a special home for 40 years because she was sick as a child.
But like you said earlier, that wasn't the whole story.
Not even close. For a long time, people have wondered what truly happened to Rosemary. Why did this young woman, part of such a famous family, just vanish from public life?
Some people even thought that she might have been involved in some kind of medical experiment.
Yeah, there were a lot of theories going around.
Definitely.
So to understand what happened later in her life, I think it's important to know a little bit about her parents, Joseph Patrick Kennedy and Rose Fitzgerald. Joseph was a very ambitious businessman.
With really high hopes for his family.
Huge hopes. And Rose, she came from a very prominent family in Boston.
A very influential family. So they were both coming from backgrounds where achievement and success were really emphasized.
Absolutely. And Rosemary, she was born in 1918. It was a very difficult time. World War I had just ended, and the Spanish flu was ravaging the world. In fact, on the day Rosemary was born, the doctor who was supposed to deliver her was actually very busy with patients who were very sick with the flu.
So he wasn't able to be there for the delivery.
Unfortunately not.
And that ended up causing some problems.
It seems that way, yeah. The nurse who was with Rose, she was actually instructed to delay the birth and wait for the doctor to arrive. And because of this, Rosemary's mother, Rose, had a really prolonged and difficult labor. And it's thought that during this delay, Rosemary might not have gotten enough oxygen, which could have caused some damage.
Wow. So this difficult birth is sort of the first chapter, you could say, in Rosemary's story.
Right. It really does seem that way, yeah. But initially, when Rosemary was born, she seemed healthy.
So it took a little while for people to notice that she was developing differently.
It did, yeah. For the first few months, she seemed to be growing and hitting milestones like any other baby. But as she got older, it became pretty apparent that she wasn't quite learning and developing at the same pace as her older brothers.
And how old was she when those differences started to become more noticeable?
Well, her mother, Rose, later wrote that when Rosemary was about a year and a half old, her brother John was already doing so many things that Rosemary wasn't doing yet.
Oh, so there was a clear contrast between them even at that young age.
Oh, yeah. Rosemary was slower to start walking and talking compared to him.
It's interesting that at first the Kennedys thought that maybe these delays were just because Rosemary was a girl, since their first few children were boys.
Yeah, they initially attributed it to gender differences. But then they had another daughter, Kathleen, who they called Kick.
Okay, so with another girl in the picture, those differences in development probably became even more obvious.
Absolutely, yeah. Rosemary was slower to walk than Kick. She started talking later. She had trouble with simple games and even things like, drawing with crayons or using a spoon.
Things that, for most children that age, come pretty naturally.
Exactly, yeah. And it's kind of puzzling because while Rose, the mother, she did keep diaries, she didn't actually write all that much about Rosemary in her early entries.
She didn't really go into detail about her development or any concerns she might have had.
No, not really. So it's hard for us now to say for sure what doctors even thought back then.
Right, because medical understanding of child development has come a long way since then.
So we don't know if Rose and Joseph connected the difficult birth to Rosemary's slower development, at least not initially.
Oh.
And we also have to remember that the Kennedys were a very busy family. They had a lot going on.
They had 9 children in total, right?
That's right, 9 children. So when Rosemary was just 2 years old, Rose was already pregnant with her 5th child. And Joseph, he was laser focused on his career and was often away or completely preoccupied with work. Rose, she really tried to manage the household and the children as efficiently as possible.
So there's a lot of pressure on her to keep everything running smoothly.
Oh, yeah. She believed in having a very structured and organized life for her children, like strict schedules for everything.
Everything was planned out.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Yeah, meals, sleep, study time, playtime, the whole 9 yards. But Rosemary, she had trouble fitting into this very rigid and competitive environment.
It sounds like there was a lot of expectation placed on the Kennedy children to excel.
Yeah, there was. And Rosemary, she just didn't always meet those expectations. So Rose, she really wanted Rosemary to go to a regular public school.
She thought that might help her development.
Yeah, she was hoping that interacting with other children in a typical school setting would be beneficial. But at the same time, both she and Joseph were worried about how other people would perceive Rosemary. They didn't want her to be ostracized or excluded because she was developing at a slower pace.
Especially back then, the understanding and acceptance of people with disabilities were very different.
Very different. And the conditions in institutions for people with intellectual disabilities or mental illness were often quite terrible.
So they wanted to protect her from that.
Absolutely. They wanted to avoid that at all costs. But despite all their efforts to help her, Rosemary continued to have difficulties in school. She had trouble with things that other children her age found quite easy.
Basic academic skills.
Yeah, and social skills as well. Then the family moved to New York.
Did that change things for Rosemary at all?
Not really, no. She still struggled in school, even when she was placed in the same class as her younger sister.
So that must have been tough for her, being compared to her younger sibling.
I'm sure it was. Yeah. And during this time, she also became more withdrawn and less interactive.
Oh, so the social aspect was becoming more challenging as well.
It was. She had difficulty with writing, with her coordination, and there were reports that she was having seizures.
So they started consulting with experts to try and understand what was going on?
They did. They were desperate for answers. Some experts thought that maybe the difficult birth was still playing a role. It was tried homeschooling Rosemary for a while, but she missed being around other children.
So that wasn't really a solution either.
No. And because the Kennedys were quite wealthy, they were able to access the best medical care available. So Rosemary was sent to different boarding schools that had specialized programs for children with learning difficulties. But even there, her teachers noted that she often seemed frustrated and struggled with low self-esteem.
It sounds like she was constantly being moved around, trying to find the right environment for her.
She was, yeah. By the time she was a teenager, she had already attended quite a few different schools. It seemed like her parents were never fully satisfied with the results they were seeing.
And all these changes and transitions, that must have been incredibly disruptive for her.
I can only imagine. It was really hard for her to concentrate or feel settled.
But despite these challenges, in many ways, Rosemary seemed like a typical young woman.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
She loved shopping, getting her hair done, watching movies.
So she had interests and passions like anyone else her age.
Absolutely. And some even said that she was the prettiest of the Kennedy sisters.
So there was this contrast between her struggles and this, very normal, even glamorous side to her.
Exactly. She also received care from an endocrinologist who thought that maybe her problems might be related to hormones.
That was a theory back then, that hormonal imbalances could be a factor in developmental issues.
Right. He prescribed her injections and these red pills, but the exact nature of these treatments is still unknown.
And did those treatments seem to help?
It doesn't seem so, no. But her parents, they never stopped searching for a cure, for a way to help her. They tried everything they could think of: special tutoring, dietary changes, more special schools, but nothing seemed to make a significant difference. By the time she was 18, she was still essentially learning at a 5th grade level. A newspaper even mistakenly reported that she was attending a university, which wasn't true at all.
Oh, wow. So there was this pressure to present a certain image of Rosemary to the public.
It seems that way, yeah. And then Joseph Kennedy, he became the U.S. ambassador to London.
So the family had to relocate.
That's right. They moved to England, and Rosemary joined them a little bit later. And while they were in London, a very significant event happened. Rosemary was presented at court to the king and queen.
That's a huge social event, especially back then.
A really big deal.
Yeah.
And there was immense pressure on her to behave perfectly, to fit in with all the other young women from prominent families. And in public, she seemed to manage quite well. But behind the scenes, she was actually living a much more sheltered and restricted life compared to her younger sister, Kik.
So publicly, they were trying to maintain this image of normalcy, but privately, she was facing different challenges.
Exactly. And while in England, She attended a convent school where she was taught using the Montessori method.
Oh, that's an interesting approach to education. It focuses on hands-on learning and individualized pacing.
Exactly, and it actually seemed to be a very positive experience for Rosemary. Away from all the pressures of high society, she seemed happier, more relaxed. But she still, always, desperately wanted to please her father.
So that pressure to meet his expectations was still there.
Very much so. And then World War II broke out.
Which forced the family to return to the U.S.
Yeah, they had to go back. And this was really difficult for Rosemary because she felt very settled and comfortable at the convent school in London.
It was another major disruption for her.
It was. And when she came back to the U.S., she had a hard time fitting in with her older siblings, especially her brothers. She became more irritable, more prone to angry outbursts, and the seizures continued.
So her condition was worsening.
It was. And at this point, the family considered sending her to a psychiatric hospital.
That must have been a very difficult decision to consider.
I'm sure it was. But instead, in 1941, they sent her to a school in Washington, D.C. But unfortunately, her condition seemed to deteriorate even further. And this is where things take a really significant turn in Rosemary's story. Her parents, especially Joseph, were becoming increasingly concerned about the family's reputation. Joseph had huge political ambitions for his sons, and he was worried that Rosemary's struggles might somehow damage their prospects.
So there was this fear that her condition might reflect negatively on the family.
Right. And he began to look into more drastic solutions, things that might address Rosemary's challenges in a more permanent way.
And this was a time when some pretty radical medical treatments were being explored.
It was. And one of these treatments was something called a lobotomy.
A lobotomy, for those who might not be familiar, is a type of brain surgery that involves cutting connections in the brain. It was first performed quite a long time ago, but in the 1930s, a Portuguese neurologist developed a new technique for lobotomy based on studies he had done on chimpanzees.
Chimpanzees, wow.
Yeah, it's kind of a strange connection, but that's how some of these medical procedures were developed back then.
And what was the goal of a lobotomy? Like, what were they hoping to achieve?
The idea was that by damaging the frontal lobes of the brain, the part of the brain responsible for things like personality and emotions, they could make patients calmer and more manageable. And this neurologist actually won a Nobel Prize for his work on lobotomy.
Wow, a Nobel Prize. That's a huge honor in the scientific world.
It is. But sadly, as time went on, it became clear that the supposed improvements seen in patients after lobotomy were often very short-lived, and the procedure itself could have devastating long-term effects on their personality and abilities.
What kind of effects are we talking about here?
Well, patients could lose their emotional responsiveness, their motivation, their ability to think clearly, to plan, to control their impulses. It could really change who they were as people.
Wow, that sounds really serious.
It was. In the U.S., a doctor named Walter Freeman became a major proponent of lobotomy, kind of a champion for the procedure. And he actually developed a faster, more streamlined method for performing lobotomies that involved inserting an instrument, something like an ice pick, through the eye socket to cut brain fibers.
Through the eye socket? That sounds unbelievably brutal.
It was a very controversial procedure, even back then. And the really disturbing thing is that it was often performed while the patient was awake.
Awake? Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. And in the early days of lobotomy, many of the patients were severely mentally ill. And there weren't really clear guidelines or regulations about when it was appropriate to use this procedure. Dr. Freeman, he considered a lobotomy successful if the patient simply showed fewer emotional outbursts or became more passive. And it's worth noting that the majority of patients who received lobotomies were women. And in some cases, they didn't even consent to the procedure.
That's really unsettling.
It is. And it was used for a wide range of mental health conditions and even for things that we wouldn't even consider medical problems today, like, women who were considered too independent or rebellious.
So it was almost used as a way to control people, particularly women.
That's a very valid interpretation. And before 1941, lobotomy wasn't typically used for people with intellectual disabilities like Rosemary.
But then something changed.
Yes. An article was published that praised the potential benefits of lobotomy, and Joseph Kennedy, Rosemary's father, he read this article.
And that sparked an idea.
It seems that way. He consulted with Dr. Freeman, and Dr. Freeman assured him that a lobotomy could make Rosemary easier to manage, less prone to outbursts, and even happier by reducing her self-consciousness and emotional struggles. He suggested that it might even allow her to live a more normal life within the family.
But did he talk to Rose about this? Did he discuss it with Rosemary herself?
That's a good question, and the answer is sadly no. Without consulting with anyone else in the family, Joseph made the decision to have the lobotomy performed on Rosemary.
On his own.
On his own. And it seems that he was really driven by this belief that this procedure could cure Rosemary, that it could finally fix the problem she had been facing her entire life.
So in November of 1941, 23-year-old Rosemary was admitted to a hospital for the procedure.
And do we know if Rosemary actually understood what was going to happen to her?
That's something we don't know for sure. But according to reports, the only thing she seemed concerned about was having her hair shaved for the surgery.
So she might not have fully grasped the gravity of the situation.
It's likely. Now, initially, Dr. Freeman used a method for lobotomy that involved drilling holes into the skull. And this is the type of lobotomy Rosemary received. And incredibly, she was awake during the procedure while the doctors were cutting connections in her brain.
Oh my gosh, that's just horrifying to think about.
It is. And during the surgery, something went terribly wrong. Rosemary stopped speaking. And it quickly became apparent that the operation had gone very, very badly.
So what happened after the surgery?
Well, Rosemary lost her ability to walk, to talk. She needed help with everything. She began having seizures.
So the procedure basically robbed her of her independence and her abilities.
In a way, yeah. She had to relearn even the most basic skills. And tragically, she became one of Dr. Freeman's case studies, the subject for his research into lobotomy. The exact details of what went wrong during her operation are still not completely known, but a nurse who assisted in the surgery was reportedly so traumatized by the experience that she quit her job immediately afterwards and was haunted by Rosemary's case for the rest of her life.
That says a lot about the impact of what happened.
It does. And Rosemary's siblings were told very little about the operation. Some were told that she had moved away to become a teacher.
So there was a lot of secrecy surrounding the whole thing.
A lot of secrecy. Eunice, one of Rosemary's sisters, she was particularly affected by Rosemary's sudden disappearance.
It must have been incredibly confusing and upsetting for her siblings.
I'm sure it was. After the operation, Rosemary stayed in the hospital for a short time, and then her father sent her to a private psychiatric facility in New York. She lived there for 7 years, slowly regaining some of her mobility and speech, but she never fully recovered.
And how often did her family visit her during this time?
Sadly, not very often. Even her parents rarely came to see her during those early years. Joseph, he paid a lot of money for her care, and initially he wrote letters saying that Rosemary was doing well, which might have been his way of reassuring his sons, or perhaps even himself. But after 1944, Rosemary was almost never mentioned in their letters. The press also stopped reporting on her. It was like she had been erased from the family narrative.
So they were trying to protect the family's image by keeping her hidden away.
It seems that way, yeah. And as Jack Kennedy's political career began to gain momentum, the fear of the truth about Rosemary's lobotomy becoming public knowledge grew.
Especially since lobotomy was starting to get a very bad reputation.
Exactly. So Joseph moved Rosemary to a facility in Wisconsin, far away from the public eye.
Another move, another upheaval for Rosemary.
Yeah. And he even had a small house built on the grounds of the facility for her to live in with her nurses. She lived there for 60 years until her death.
And her father never went to visit her there.
Never. It's really heartbreaking to think about. The Kennedy family returned to prominence as Jack entered politics and eventually became president.
And what was being said about Rosemary during this time?
The truth about her situation was known only to a very small circle of people. In 1960, during Jack's presidential campaign, a magazine did mention Rosemary's institutionalization, but they gave an incorrect diagnosis and made no mention of the lobotomy. The article did include a quote from Joseph Kennedy suggesting that it was better to be open about such things, but he, of course, wasn't being completely truthful.
So they were still very much trying to control the narrative.
Absolutely. And when asked directly about Rosemary, Joseph gave very vague answers, often attributing her condition to the hand of God.
That's a very convenient way to avoid the truth.
It is. After Jack became president, it was publicly acknowledged that he had a sister with intellectual disabilities, but again, there was no mention of the lobotomy.
So the truth was still being hidden.
It was. Later on, Rosemary's sister, Eunice, she wrote an article about the challenges faced by families with children with intellectual disabilities. And she even included Rosemary's story in the article.
But she didn't mention the lobotomy.
No. And their mother, Rose, she also became an advocate for people with intellectual disabilities, giving interviews and talking about accepting Rosemary for who she was. But again, the lobotomy was never mentioned.
It's almost like they were trying to rewrite history to erase that part of her story.
It really seems that way. And there are accounts that suggest Rosemary may have had some fragmented memories of the operation and of her mother's absence during those early years after the procedure.
That's really sad to think about.
It is. After President Kennedy was assassinated, Eunice took on a much more active role in Rosemary's care. Other family members also started to visit her more frequently.
So there was a shift in the family dynamic after that tragedy.
There was. And in the late 1960s, Rose began writing her memoirs.
And did she address Rosemary's situation in her memoirs?
Well, the writer who was helping her with the book learned about Rosemary and the facility where she was living. And when asked about Rosemary's condition, Rose initially said it was an accident. She only later revealed that it was a lobotomy, but she didn't go into detail about it in her book, which was published in 1974 and made no mention of the surgery at all.
So even in her own autobiography, she chose to omit that crucial piece of information.
She did. Rose continued to manage Rosemary's care from a distance. Rosemary was occasionally brought to visit the family homes in her later years, but those visits were reportedly quite stressful for Rose.
So there was still a lot of emotional baggage surrounding the whole situation.
It seemed so. But as Rosemary got older, she actually had fewer outbursts and was better able to communicate her needs. And from what we know, she seemed content with her daily routine at the facility.
So in a way, she found a kind of peace in her later years.
It seems that way, yeah. But the truth about Rosemary's lobotomy, it remained a closely guarded family secret until 1987, a full 46 years after the procedure was performed. And it was only then that a book was published that had access to Joseph Kennedy's private papers, and this book finally revealed the full story of Rosemary's life and the experimental brain surgery she had undergone. But even in this book, the section about Rosemary was relatively short. It included quotes from Rose expressing concern about Rosemary's condition and Joseph's decision to have the lobotomy performed without consulting her.
So even after the truth came out, there was still a sense of trying to downplay or minimize what had happened.
Yeah. And Rose later claimed that she had been kept in the dark about the operation for 20 years. But other evidence suggests that she likely knew or at least suspected what had happened.
It's a very complex and tragic story.
It is. And Rosemary Kennedy, she passed away in 2005 at the age of 86.
Her life really raises a lot of questions about medical ethics, family secrets, and how society views and treats people with disabilities.
It does. Some people view Rosemary's story as a tragic example of how families with power and wealth and who are concerned about their reputation can sometimes make very difficult decisions that have devastating consequences. Others see it as the beginning of the Kennedy curse, a series of misfortunes that plague the family, though it's debatable whether those events are actually connected to Rosemary's lobotomy.
It's hard to say for sure.
It is. And I think it's important to consider whether Rosemary's parents were acting out of fear and desperation. Maybe they truly believed that this radical procedure was the best option for their daughter, given the limited medical understanding at the time. And despite the choices they made, there is evidence that they did provide for her care throughout her life.
So they were trying to do what they thought was best, however misguided their actions might have been.
I think that's a fair assessment. Rosemary's story is really thought-provoking. It makes you think about the evolution of medical practices, about the pressures faced by families with members who have disabilities, and about the importance of informed consent and patient autonomy.
Absolutely. It's a story that stays with you.
It does. And for those of you listening, we'd love to hear your thoughts on Rosemary Kennedy's story. Share your comments below. And if you're enjoying this deep dive and want to learn more about fascinating topics while improving your English skills, be sure to subscribe to the English with Narayana channel. Learning English opens up a whole world of knowledge, just like the information we explored today.
And remember, podcasts like this can be a fantastic way to learn English.
They are. You can listen while you're doing other things, and it helps you improve your listening comprehension and vocabulary.
So keep practicing, keep learning, and keep exploring.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into Rosemary Kennedy's life.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, goodbye.
Goodbye, everyone.